Hi everyone and welcome to my channel, and to this, the next in my series of paint along demos in soft pastel. This series, free to those on YouTube, is designed to get you into pastel and give you something to work along with. This time, based on the popularity of my last people portrait, I've decided to tackle a different gender, a different type of skin tone, so I'm really looking forward to working on this one, and I hope that many of you will work along with me. If you do enjoy this, then please do subscribe here on YouTube and also check out all of my other videos here. I have lots on my channel here to help you get into the world of soft pastel. Also, check me out over on my Patreon channel, where you can join our growing community of artists and learn from even more in-depth tutorials and lots more. So I hope that you enjoy this, and let's get started. So before I make a start, let's give you some information so that you know what materials you'll need so that you can work along with me. I'm using velour paper. It's the sand colour of velour paper. And this is about 9 by 12 inches, so roughly A4 size. Don't be afraid to work a bit bigger if you want a bit more space for detail, but this is really as small as you would want to go. I also spent a couple of hours working on my line sketch for this. I enjoy working freehand for my sketches sometimes, although I often use a grid. And you can see here on screen, I'll show the photo reference alongside my line sketch. And I did actually give myself 1 or 2 guidelines here, just because of the complexity of the angle of her head. So those couple of guidelines really helped me get the angle of her face correct in this. So have a go at sketching it out. I'll add the photo reference here on screen for you if you want to pause and use that to sketch from. Also, if you're on my Patreon channel, you can access the full download with high resolution images, my line sketch, and lots more to help you out. So I basically took my line sketch, which I did on regular paper, covered the back of this in soft pastel, don't forget to rub it in well, and then I transferred this line sketch onto my drawing. So it gives me a nice clean line to start the colour work with. These are the colours that I've chosen out before I get started. But no doubt I will have picked up a few or changed a few throughout the painting process. So here on screen I will show you the full colour list used within the painting so that you can gather these colours together, or if you don't have these exact colours, don't worry, you can always substitute for something close that you have in your own palette. But these colours that I chose before I started painting will really help me get going. And I'm going to make a bonus video just for my patrons, talking about how I choose a range of colour to get me started, what I'm looking for in the photo reference, and how that really helps my painting process. So I'm using mostly Unison colour pastels. I'll also use a range of pastel pencils for some detail. But if we're ready to start, let's go. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is just block in a bit of background colour. And I'm not going to be too concerned about what happens with the background in this piece, as my main focus is to try my best to get through as much of this portrait as physically possible in the time. And I've given up trying to guess how long it's going to take me, as I'm usually wrong. So let's just work ahead and see what happens. Usually try and fit these shorter demos in under 3 or 4 hours at the very most. So let's just see. So I'm going to go quite neutral with the background. There's a bit of a shadow behind her on the wall. Maybe I'll have some time to have a think about that when I come that far. But I really just want to maybe make the background colour a little bit lighter so that her lovely deep tones and her dark hair stand out really nicely against that. So I'm just using the side of the pastel and very lightly rubbing it over the paper so I'm not leaning very heavily here. And maybe at the end I'll come back and add some extra tones to the background, but for now I'd really like it just to be something plain to get me going. As I said, her lovely dark hair should stand out really well against something light. And I'm not even worried about going right to the very edges. As I said, maybe I can go back at the end and do something more with this background, but let's just get straight on to her skin tones and make a start on the face. So on Velour usually I give my layers a good rub into the paper. You can of course use another paper to work along with me. I also use pastel matte, and you'll be able to work along with me just the same. And I love both of those papers, both Velour and pastel matte. So just grab whatever materials you have and work along. So I'll just firstly get an idea of her hairline back in. You can see that I work actually over the edges of the hairline a little bit when I'm doing the background. And that's because you're going to see lots of little flyaway hairs through the hair, and you're going to see the background behind. But this hair, which just frames this side of her face, and just getting a little hint of that darkness back in there again, as that's going to help me when I come to do the highlights down that side of her face. So again, the hair is something that I'll worry about later if I have enough time. But for this side of the face, it's just quite useful, as it creates a good dark contrast in there. And such lovely curly hair going on, so I hope that I do have some time to come back at the end of this portrait and work a little bit on the hair, but my main priority for today really is to work on the skin tones. Let you see how I would build that up. I have a few more portraits here on my channel, but most of them are lighter skin tones, so I've been asked to try some deeper, richer skin tones, and that's something I've been looking forward to trying myself. So a big thank you to my lovely friend who modelled for these. She's got the perfect face to work on. And I had a few photo references to choose from, and I let the guys on my Patreon channel make the final decision because I just couldn't decide which one to work on. They were all so nice, and they've chosen me quite a challenge because not only is her head at an unusual angle, so tilted up, and also open mouth with teeth on show, so for a shorter demo that's a bit of a challenge, but I thought it was a great one to work on because many people find teeth particularly difficult to paint. So hopefully I can show you some good tricks for that today. And if it's a challenge for me, then I know that it's a good challenge for you guys as well, and that's what I like to do. I don't like to give you easy things. So I hope that you will work along and that you'll enjoy this. Just getting a little bit of the hair. I might as well block it in, I suppose. just give us some darkness up here. Gives me something to judge my tones off. And it gives me this lovely dark contrasted line down the side of her face. So I don't usually go for the hair first, but in this case, because it's over the other side of her face here, it's quite good just to get some of that dark contrast in early. So let's zoom in a bit now on the face and we'll make a start on the skin tones. So the first things that I tend to go for are some of the darker areas. So I do like to tackle the dark things first and work my way up from dark to light. So the first thing that I do is pick up this dark 2, which is quite similar to some of the deeper red earths, and just look for some of those darkest areas. Now it's going to look very severe, very strong with these dark colours going in first. But the thing with soft pastel is that you really want to get those dark colours down first. And any other colours that you would like to glow through the skin tones, you want those to go down first, and then all of your lighter tones coming in on top will soften the effect. And everything should blend together nicely. So that's what a good pastel paper should let you do. It should let you layer things up gradually, and it should let your lighter colours go on over the top of your dark colours. So don't worry about it looking really severe at this stage. Try and be brave and get those dark colours down first. Look for everywhere where there's shadow, the creases on the face, and lay your dark colours into those creases to begin with. I don't have to be particularly neat in the first layers. I'm just aiming the bigger stick roughly to where I want the pigment to go, remembering that my next layers with the lighter colours, I'll be able to start to add the detail and neaten things up. So the main thing is just to get some pigment on the paper, create some of the darkest contrast. And of course the lovely vibrant red top that she's wearing is going to come into play in this portrait, because we're going to get a little bit of reflection of some areas of her skin. So I'm going to be able to bring some of those lovely vibrant reds into her skin tone as well. So don't forget to think about what the person you're painting is wearing. Does the colour of their top especially, which is under their chin, does that affect the colours there? Always try and look for how the colours in the surrounding areas are affecting whatever it is you're painting, whether it's a person or an animal or a still life or whatever it is. Make sure you're thinking about those surrounding areas and how colours might be reflected. So the nice thing about pastels like this is the ability to get sharp edges for details, but to also use them on their side when you want to block in an area. So it really is like having different sized paint brushes, but without the bother of having to clean lots of paint brushes. That's one of the reasons that I love soft pastel. So I usually sketch out my portraits before I begin. As I mentioned at the start, I like to start with a nice clean line. But then it's really the job of the colour and the tonal values to bring out the form of the face. So my sketch looks quite flat when I transfer it on, but I'm really just using it hopefully to get the proportions correct. And to have a lot of the tricky work done by the time I actually come to the colour stages. Of course, there are many methods to painting portraits. This is just my method. You don't have to start with a sketch initially. You can work by blocking in areas and building it up like that. It's just whatever you're more comfortable with, and I do like to have the proportions figured out before I make a start on the colour work. And hopefully I've managed to do that with her face. We will soon see as I start to bring out the tones and build up more of the form of her face now. So a little tiny piece of pastel. This is my BE6, and often when I lay out some colours to use, I will lay out the big stick, and I'll also try and find a little pebble of it to use as well, as quite often that little pebble is the most useful tool. Just for getting smaller and more precise marks. And of course I will break out the pastel pencils at some point as well, just to get really fine lines, and especially around the eyes where I need a bit more detail. But at this stage I'm not really thinking about detail. It's really just like my blocking in stage, I suppose. Looking for everywhere that has the darkest values. Oh dear, we've got a rooster crowing. It's the middle of the afternoon. What's he doing? He really hasn't got a clue what time of the day it is. He's the worst timekeeper for a rooster I've ever met. But maybe he's not too loud for the video. Sorry if you can hear him, but we'll work on anyway. Do my best to ignore him. So yeah, just totally focusing on any of the creases on the face, around the nostrils. And of course the light in the photo is coming from her left, so we've got a lot of highlight colour down this side of her face, and it's mostly in shadow over on this side. So there will be a difference between the tones that I use on both sides of the face, especially when it comes to the highlight colours, which you'll see when I get to that stage. So with my first layers, I'm normally really trying to go a bit too dark to begin with, as those rich colours will shine through the later layers, and that's an especially good thing when you're thinking about skin tones, because our skin really does shine with the colours that are underneath our skin. Sometimes the colour of our veins, lots of different tones shine through our skin tones. So it's good for it to look like it's multi-layered rather than just all one colour put down at once. And when I'm working on velour, that involves a bit of blending into the paper. Just making sure that each of my layers as I put it on is well rubbed into the paper, so that the paper then is able to accept all the new layers. So if you're working on velour paper, try and get used to rubbing those layers well in. Don't worry about it going a bit fuzzy looking, about the pastel pigment moving across the piece like this. You can see what a mess mine looks at this stage, but it's better to have all of that pigment really rubbed in and almost staining the paper. And just trust that later on you can bring out the details that you want. But that's going to be much harder to do if all of this early pigment that you put down is just sitting loosely on the surface of the paper. So the key thing with the velour paper especially is to make sure that you get it all well rubbed in. So really at this stage, moving from the darkest tones, just looking at any mid-tone areas. Just paying attention to the forms on the face, where those highlights are going to go later. And don't be alarmed if yours also looks a bit of a mess or a bit scary at this stage usually. It's really once you start to bring in the highlights, I find, that a portrait starts to come to life. So you've really got to be quite patient in these early layers and get all of those rich colours down first. If you start coming in too early with your highlights, then you're going to lose all of the nice contrast and depth to the skin. So try and be patient, brave these ugly stages. It's difficult to make a face like this look ugly, she's so beautiful, but it's always possible in the painting process. You've got to go through the ugly stages, we all do. And it's usually about trying to be patient during that part of the process. And not rushing things just to try and get it to instantly look better. So try and be patient. It's usually the most difficult part of any painting. Just not freaking out when it looks a bit odd at some stages. You've just got to trust that that's the stage it needs to go through. And hope that you can bring it out the other side. That's what I'm hoping for. So this ear is going to be pretty well concealed by the hair when I come to that later on. So there's not a whole lot that I'm going to be able to do with that ear. It's pretty dark in there. I may just lay in some colour. And it really is going to be pretty much covered over with the hair. But we will see a hint of it through there, so that's something to add in at this stage, so that when I come to do the hair, I'm literally putting it over the top of the ear. So I'm going to use a little bit of green in some areas. Again, try and really look at the photo reference that you're painting from. Try and see tones that your brain doesn't necessarily want to accept are in there. And I am stretching it a bit here to add a bit of green in, but with all of the lovely red tones in her skin, and this is quite a subtle green tone here, but it is going to add a very nice element of opposite colour to this. So just around some of the areas over on the shadow side of the face. And within the lower layers, so it's not going to be something that really shines out. And also some really rich red tones, like I mentioned earlier. We're going to get a bit of red reflection off of her top. So especially around this shadow side of her face. Often in the shadows, that's where you get the most interesting amount of colour. Sometimes the highlights can look a bit washed out, so really look within the shadow side if you can find other colours to layer up, just to add that extra depth to the portrait. But really at this stage, I'm still just blocking in, working my way around the face, trying to get most of the paper covered at this stage. Pastel papers tend to work best once you get a couple of layers down, so my aim is to just get the paper covered. And then I can start to come in with a few mid-tones and highlights to start to give the face some of its form. And the reason that I chose the velour paper over the pastel matte paper is that I tend to find I'm a bit faster on velour. So for a demo like this, it's usually my choice, just because I can move a bit faster. I can be a bit more painterly, I find, on the velour paper. And I really love the pastel matte as well, especially for the amount of detail that you can get on it. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of the light coming from this side of the face. So at this early stage, I'm just going to start to pick out a few of the strongest highlighted areas on this side of the face. It's really going to help me start to see the form of the face. And even though it's the brightest highlights that I'm going for, I'm not going straight for my brightest colour. Just going for this mid-tone to light. And I'll start to work some of that brightest highlight area up. Sometimes when there's a really bright area on a face or any subject matter, it can be good to get that blocked in early along with the dark colours, because it really helps you to start to see the form and the shapes. So I'll often do that even if it's on a dog portrait or a still life object, whatever it is, even within a landscape. So it's all about just trying to gradually build up the form so that it looks 3D. But even though I've got my line sketch, which was pretty accurate to begin with, I'm still constantly looking at the photo reference. Just like if you had a life model posing for you, try and pay particular attention to your reference. Really try to paint what you see and don't get carried away working for a long time without looking at your reference. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this black area of the hair is really going to help me frame the face. So I'm just going to work on this side of the face at the moment and try and bring a few of these highlights up a bit brighter, just to start to give us the 3D effect. So again, not going for white here. One of my lovely Unison off-white shades with a nice yellow tint to it. I don't use pure white all that often. I tend to like the lighter tints. So if it's warmth that I'm looking for, it might be a light tint with a hint of yellow to it. And if it's over in my shadow areas, perhaps it will have a hint of lilac or blue, as you're going to see when I'm highlighting on the other side of the face. But the light hitting this side of the face really is quite strong, and that's lovely to get in a photo reference because it gives you good light and shade, good contrast across the face. It really helps in a painting because it helps those features to look even more 3D in your painting. So I'm always advising my patrons on Patreon, when they're choosing photo reference to work from, especially if you're just learning, try and choose one with good light and shade, some good directional light, as it makes your colour choices that little bit more obvious. What to go for is a bit more obvious. If your photo reference is entirely in shade and the lighting is very flat across the face, well, that can be the trickiest type of photo reference to try and choose values for. I always find more flatly lit subjects a lot more difficult. So you would think perhaps that sunlight is difficult to capture, but to me it makes the colour values even more obvious than they would be in the shade. So just picking out the areas where the light is really catching down the left side of the face. And of course, some of these highlights will come over onto the nose area as well, down onto the chin. Just at this stage, being careful not to put too much highlight colour down. I really just want it to help me to start to see the form a little better. But I've still got a lot of work to do with my mid-tones, so it's really just this left side of the face that I'm trying to pick out. And I'm still not worrying about being too precise with it. There's a lot of tweaking I can do with the pencils a little bit later. But at this stage I'm really just looking for this left side, the shape over here. And of course I can use my black then to come back in and really try to shape this side of the face. And it really is quite dark in there where her hair is. So that's really good for helping me define this side of the face. And in some areas now where I want the dark to be really dark, I can start to lean a bit heavier. Before, I'm not leaning too heavily with the black. But you can see how getting some of that dark contrast in there immediately starts to help the face to stand out more. Another thing that I want to do before I go any further really with the skin tones is just outline the eyes a little bit using a good dark pastel pencil. I don't want to lose my outline here with it getting covered over in the soft pastel, so I'm just going to strengthen the outline that I had on the paper before it disappears under all of my layers. The nice thing about velour is that you can often still see a little bit of an indent in the paper where you transferred your line. So you don't tend to lose your outline completely, you can still faintly see it in there. But this will also help me a little bit just in seeing the values around this area. Again, getting the darkest darks in can be really helpful. And just be always careful around eyes, whether you should really use pure black for an area. She does have beautiful dark eyes, so black is quite good in this case. But even on the bottom rim here, just for now, I'm going to use a dark brown. You don't want eyes to look like you've just put a big black outline around them. So just be careful with your use of black in the eyes. But even just this is enough for me to strengthen my outline again, make sure that I don't lose that. And it's a really lovely angle she has her face at, just gazing upwards. We had a few wonderful shots of this model to choose from, but I'm so glad that my patrons chose this one, even though it's the harder of the shots because of the angle of the face. Also the fact that there are teeth on show, and for a shorter demo I think I'm probably being quite ambitious with all of that. But there was just no denying that to me this shot really sums her up most. So if you're doing a portrait of someone, especially if you're having to do it from a photograph, try to make sure that you've at least got a photograph of the person that really sums up their character. Because most people, especially myself, can look really different from photograph to photograph. I can look like an entirely different person sometimes just because of the angle or my expression. And sometimes it's difficult to know if you're given a photograph to work from for a portrait. Try to make sure with your client that that photograph that you're going to work from really does look like the person, it really does capture them. Because if the photo doesn't capture them well, it's going to be very difficult for you to capture them well, especially if you don't know the person. So that's sometimes a downfall when you're working from photographs for portraits. That's obviously why a lot of artists prefer to work from life for this sort of thing. And whilst I really like working from life, I do love to be able to take my time and work from a photograph in the studio. So I'm a fan of both, but most of my commissioned work is done from photo reference. But I also really stress the importance of trying to draw from life, sketch from life. All of this will really help build your skills, improve your eye. So while I have the pastel pencils in my hand here, just starting to strengthen and shape some of the areas, for example around the nostrils here. And I'm using a dark brown pencil for this. So it's often a tricky part to try and get a nose to look 3D. Especially when you're seeing a face from the front. And a lot of the time it's those all important highlight colours that will help take the flatness out of this feature. Just adding a little bit of vibrance inside the nostrils. Always looking for areas that I can add a bit of extra vibrance rather than just the flat colours of browns and blacks. So as I mentioned earlier, it's often in the shadow areas where you can add that extra bit of vibrance. So let's try and pick out a little bit of highlight running down the nose and see if we can start to get a more 3D feel to this feature. Of course, for your highlights to stand out, you really need them to be surrounded by all of the correct values. So just making sure that I've gone dark enough on the other areas of the nose. It's really your dark values that are most important when it comes to making your bright values stand out. Colour is so relative, so if you want something to look brighter, the chances are you need to make the surrounding colours a bit darker. So just looking for the shape that the highlight colour creates, using some little points on the end of the pastel. And of course, when you're using your fingers to blend on the velour, you can lean heavily or quite lightly if you just want to lightly blend something into the paper. So try and experiment with how heavily you blend in certain areas to get the effect that you're wanting. And I always advise not being too heavy-handed when you first start to come in with the lighter colours. Try to think of it in terms of building it up gradually. It's more difficult to tone something down if you come in too brightly at the start, whereas you can easily add more and layer it up gradually. Deciding where you need to lean a little bit more heavily. So as I said, the pastel pencils do come in very useful to me on a people portrait. A lot of people ask me about getting strong marks using your pastel pencil, especially on the velour paper. Sometimes it doesn't seem to have real strength to the marks, and that's often exactly what I'm looking for when it comes to the pastel pencil marks. I'm looking for a more subtle mark, so it's not the thing that I pick up when I want something really strong and vibrant. It's my tool for when I need a little soft mark here and there, something not too strong, especially where the lighter colours are concerned. So when I want strong, vibrant marks, I try to make those with the soft pastel sticks, as you get much more strength from them. But definitely for the more subtle adjustments that I need to make, the pastel pencils are so useful. And the lovely thing about pastel is how versatile and forgiving it is. So you can really sit and tweak at a feature until you get it just right. So that's the good thing about not leaning too heavily at the start. Trying to build things up gradually. Leaving lots of space on the paper for your later layers. So you're also going to see me pick up quite a lot of blue in this portrait. I'm going to try and counter all of the lovely red-orange tones that we're seeing with some really nice blue highlights. Hopefully that's going to work really nicely as an opposite colour on the other side of the face. So really these first stages of a portrait for me aren't about focusing on any one feature in particular. I'm really just trying to pick out the overall structures on the face. So looking for the biggest shapes. Then once I have the bigger shapes in, it will become easier to come back in and start to add the detail. So I think a face can be a bit overwhelming at the start. It's good to just try and break it down into the more simple shapes. Look for the larger areas. And as I keep saying, try to layer your colours up as opposed to getting the right colour in the first go. For me, I find that works really well with pastel because it's so easily layered. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I will make an extra bonus video for my patrons, as they've expressed some interest in this, on how I go about choosing the colours for a portrait like this. So I did spend some time at the beginning, before I started painting, just having a close look at the photo reference on screen. Really trying to decide which colours to set out in my tray to get me started. Of course, I will probably pick up a few extras, but I'm also trying to limit myself to quite a small palette here, partly so that lots of you guys can work along, even if you don't have a huge pastel collection. Hopefully you'll be able to find good substitutions for many of the colours that I'm using. So just really trying to shape this side of the face. And again, I can use the black of her hair behind just to help shape this part of her jawline. Just being careful because the black doesn't run solidly the whole way around her face. There are some gaps where the hair isn't covering the entire background, and we do want to see some of the background through that. But you start to get the effect and how I'll be able to create the finer hairs after a while on this side of the face. But for now it's just helping me start to see some of the 3D-ness of her face. So it's always a little bit experimental when I'm working on a people portrait, especially one with skin tones that I'm not used to painting. So I don't always know exactly what I need to do, but that is the wonderful thing about pastel. It really lets you experiment a little bit. If you add a colour lightly and you don't think it looks right when it's on the paper, then it allows you to work over the top of that. It's not quite as unforgiving as, for example, watercolours. I find even more difficult because you've got to be pretty sure of your colour choices. In some ways there's no going back on watercolour. So for me, pastel is a good bit easier because you can adjust things, rework areas, and that's why I'm always suggesting to work with a lighter touch, because it gives you plenty of time to change your mind. So I don't always know what I'm doing with a portrait. If you're feeling a bit lost when you try a people portrait, don't worry, the key is to just take your time, try and battle on, and make the small adjustments that you need to make as you go. So I really enjoy this part of a portrait, not worrying about the detail just yet, just laying in the colour. And it's in these moments that you begin to see some life come into the face from being a blank page. And that's always a lot of fun. Just trying to look for the extra colours where I can inject a bit more vibrance into the face. And then also starting to pick out some of the areas where that dark contrast is going to make all the difference. A lot of people don't really like to use pure black. For me, with realism, I find having the full tonal range within your work really does help. And especially in a portrait like this where the hair is really dark, the eyes are really dark. To me, it's going to be necessary to get some of those darkest values to really have a lot of depth to them. And that's only going to help all of my brighter highlights to stand out. So again, at this stage, just leaning a little bit more heavily around the outskirts of the face here. Again, it's going to help me just see these face values a little more clearly. Of course, when it comes to the use of solid black, it's great to come in with other colours on top of those areas to liven them up a bit. But it really starts to help just to see some of that darkest contrast there. Helps me see how much brighter or how much darker I need to go on certain areas of the face. So I'm hoping that during this demo I will at least get the face done. That's my aim. There's quite a lot of work to do here. I'm trying to not keep an eye on the clock as I go. So you could be in for a long afternoon or evening painting with me if that's what you're doing. But I will do my best to get as much of it finished as possible in a reasonable amount of time, because I like these paint along demos to be a doable length of time. Something that you can complete within one day at least. That's my aim for these. So I just want to start and add a few highlight colours over on this side of the face, just to start and pick out some of the form on the shadow side of the face. And then I can really start to tweak at what I've got on the paper. Once I've got a good basis down, then I can really start to tweak at what I've got and shape things more precisely into place. Because at the moment I'm starting to get a feel for the form of the face, but it's still pretty rough looking. Some harsh edges which you don't really get on softer skin tones. So I mentioned that I want to make use of some blue on the side of the face. That's going to give us a nice indication of this side being more in the shade. And as well as that deeper blue, there will be some areas where I use this lovely light tint, BV7. And this is one of the colours actually in my animal set, my Unison animal set. And I've often found that I'm able to complete human portraits from that set as well, because there's quite a few fleshy colours in it. So many of these colours you will find in my Unison animal set if you've got that, and perhaps this is your first time trying a human portrait. Perhaps you normally only paint animals. Well, without investing in a whole lot of new materials and spending even more money to buy portrait sets, have a go with your animal set, because there are a lot of flesh colours, brown tones, a lot of good universal highlight colours in that set. So just looking for this shine on her skin. And also trying to soften the edges of my highlight areas. You don't want those areas to look too harsh or stand out too much. Quite often you will get some bright, shiny highlights along the top of our brow area. Again, try not to go too bright on some of these highlights. You don't want them to stand out too much. And I'm just going to quickly get the brow blocked in here so that I can see where I'm working to. Again, that should help me see some of the darker values around the eyebrow. So I can come back and work on this more, but just for now, to roughly get the shape of the brow in would be useful. Our eyebrows are so important, they really frame our face. So a portrait always starts to look a bit better when you get the eyebrows in. Just shows you how strange we would look without them. Really don't have to do too much to it at this stage, just to get it blocked in. And a bit like when you're painting fur, try to look at the direction of the hairs and make your marks roughly in that direction. Try to gradate it out with lighter marks around the edges. You don't want them to look like big caterpillars, unless the person actually has big caterpillar shaped eyebrows, which isn't unusual these days. No offense to anyone who has large caterpillar eyebrows. I think the more hair you can have in your eyebrows, the better. It really helps to frame your face nicely. To lighten some of this side of the eyebrow down a little bit, because again we're over into the daylight here, but I will come back and work more on the eyebrows again. It's really just to help get them in, get the shape where they need to be. So this is quite a small scale for a face on the velour paper. If you're working along, maybe you've made it a little bit bigger. That will allow you to get more detail in if that's what you want. But for me, trying to think of some kind of time limit, smaller is a bit better for me for that reason. Just trying to get as much demoed as possible, give you as many tips for your own people portraits. And even if you're not working along, I hope that you can take some of these hints and techniques and apply them to your own portraits. So I'm just looking for little areas of shine. Even though this is quite a mid-tone blue, it really does stand out like a highlight would, just because of how dark the surrounding brown areas are. So again, if your highlights aren't standing out enough, you need to consider whether you've made the colours around your highlights dark enough, as that's usually the reason why. And if you can hear a dog snoring in the background, I'm not sure if my microphone will pick that up, but I'm usually surrounded by animals while I work, so if you get some animal interference, please know that it's not me making those noises. So I'm picking up a little bit of white pastel pencil here, perhaps even just to start this light tint, this yellow tint. I find, especially when I'm using the pastel pencils, I'm not going to get the bright white from the pencil. It's going to, at this stage especially, now that I've got some layers of soft pastel on my paper, it's going to sort of mix with the layer below. So it's not that I want it to be bright white, it's usually that I'm just trying to tint the colour of soft pastel that I've already put down. And of course you can lean more heavily with the pastel pencils when you want to get a more a stronger mark on the paper. So you can go over it a few times, really scrape the pigment into the paper. And as always, these smaller shards of pastel, I've either dropped a pastel in the past to create this, or my bigger stick has eventually worn down. If you've got a brand new box of pastels though and you don't have any small pieces, well, maybe you want to consider breaking one in half, and then you can keep a half pastel, which is more than big enough for most jobs when you need a bigger piece, and use the other half to start to break down into these smaller shards. Sometimes by accident I'll drop one on the ground, and although you do gasp at the time, it's normally quite a happy accident because you end up with some wonderfully small pieces of pastel to make those more precise marks with. So it usually is a good thing in the end. So don't worry about breaking them up. You will only find that they become more useful the smaller those pieces are. And I find that especially with my highlight colours. I like to have my highlight colours in lots of little small pieces, as well as some full sticks. But quite often the highlights, when you're adding them, are just a little dot or strip of colour here and there, and to have those smaller pieces of pastel is actually much more useful. So they're beautiful when they come brand new in the box with all their papers on. I know how pretty they are. But my first bit of advice with soft pastel is to not be scared to break them up. That's really when they become their most useful. So I'm really using the pastel pencil here, not so much to add a lot more pigment to the paper. I'm more like rubbing away some of those lighter colours to reveal the dark colour that I put down first underneath. So you can really use it like a blending tool. And sometimes where you just can't quite get the little bit of highlight to go in where you want it. Like in this case where I just want a little bit of blue down that edge of the eyelid. Then it's great to have a similar colour of pastel pencil to come back in with and just strengthen that highlight. But I hope that you can begin to see how that lovely blue tone is going to work to create my shadow tones. So I feel like we're starting to get somewhere, still a long way to go. This is where I begin to think, how long has that camera been rolling? But I think I'm making good progress, so let's just continue. No doubt I won't get this portrait finished to the standard that I normally would with my commissioned work. But I'm really trying to think quickly, think of the most important elements that I can show you, and hope that I can capture some of her lovely likeness. I would love to be able to gift this to her afterwards to thank her for agreeing to model and doing such a great job, such a natural person to photograph. And sometimes you get one of those faces that's just filled with joy. I tend to look a bit grumpy in a lot of photographs, and I'm not grumpy, but I just can't help looking a bit grumpy sometimes in photographs. But this person is just so naturally full of joy, and it comes across even in her photographs. So the absolute perfect model, in my opinion. And I hope that I can do that justice. I would really like to. So even though this isn't a commission, I'd love to think that I can get it to a finished enough standard to be able to gift it to her. We shall see. So I don't often come in with the eyes early on in a portrait, as you'll see. I like to work all of the skin tones, all of the structure of the face first. To me, it's more important to get the structure of the face in. I know a lot of people like to start off with eyes, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But for me, I breathe much easier once I get to the stage of having the structure of the face in. The eyes aren't usually too much of a problem. To me, it's more precarious during the stages of trying to capture the likeness through the overall structure and shapes on the face. So it's much more important to me to work on that first. Then by the time it comes to do the eyes, I'm pretty sure by then that I've got them nicely placed on the face. At this stage I can still make adjustments to the angle of the eyes, where I've placed them. It's no problem to make those adjustments. But if you come in very early on with the eyes and you get a lot of detail done, and then later on you realise that really one needs to be slightly to the left or slightly to the right, it becomes very difficult to make those adjustments at that stage. So that's why the form of the face is more important to me at this stage. And those main features can easily come a bit later when I'm more sure of what I've got down. Just a little bit of fine tuning around the nose here, see if I can get that feature to really start to pop out. Again, thinking about where I'm seeing much cooler highlights, so not as bright as white or any of my yellowy tints. Remembering how those blues will really help enhance the 3D feel, going nicely against all of the orange tones. And this is where the pastel pencils do become really useful. Just minor little adjustments like this. Absolutely no problem on this paper when you've got a nice fine point. And when you haven't oversaturated the paper with lots and lots of layers of pastel, there's a lot of room for going back and forth like this, making these smaller adjustments. So the lips I will leave probably until I've got the top half of the face worked. That's often the norm for me. I don't want to be leaning on those while I'm working on the eyes, for instance. Part of my game plan is about not smudging the work that I've already done. So sometimes that does mean working from the top downwards a little bit, as that just seems to make more sense. So again, using a little bit of white, but it's more or less to tint the colours underneath. Not getting a really strong white from this when I apply it. And that's just what I want. Just using it very lightly. Need to try and lighten this side of the nostril a little bit. I feel that I've gone too dark over here and the whole thing begins to look like one big nostril. So just coming back in with this lovely vibrant shade, bringing more of that down the nose where I can see it. Trying to see how far across the bridge of the nose the highlight area goes. And saving just a little hint of the blackness inside the nostril. More so on this side, I would say, just because of the light and shade in the photo reference. But again, you don't want your nostrils to just look like big black holes, so be careful how much black you decide to use in there. So these really are areas that you want to spend a bit of time on. The main features can really make or break a portrait. I'm just looking at the photo reference lots while I'm doing this, really trying to analyze each little shape and curve, noticing where it gets darker, and of course the light on this side of the face is a bit brighter than the other side. So the outline of the nose on this side is actually quite subtle. Just trying to lighten the other cheek here. Again, just because this is facing in a little bit, it's getting a bit more of the blue highlight as we get closer to the nose. So really not easy to get a lot of strong pigment from your pastel pencils, mostly with the lighter colours. And that's exactly what I'm looking for when it comes to people portraits. Just making those subtle differences. Not trying to get a really bright, vibrant colour onto the paper here. You can see how that just tints that lovely, vibrant, fleshy orange. Just enough so that it lightens it, we can see it. And of course, sometimes your lighter colours might get contaminating your darker colours, so it's good to always come back in and re-darken some of those darkest areas.